Canada has had a housing affordability problem for a while now, but with rates rising, we have to include people who already own a home, or at least have a mortgage on one. Here's a look at the effect of rising rates by the numbers. After a huge jump in the number of variable rate mortgages during pandemic, they now make up about 1/3 of all mortgages in Canada. That's up from 20% at the end of 2019. Of those variable rate mortgages, the majority, or 3/4, have fixed payments. So when rates rise, the payment stays the same, but the amount of that payment going to just interest versus the principal owed on the house also changes. When interest rates cause the payment amount to be equal to the interest amount, that's called the trigger rate. In other words, no principal is being paid. On a $500,000 30-year mortgage at a 1.5% interest rate, the monthly payment would be $1,724. Most of that would go to principal repayment, or $1,101. $623 would go to the interest on the loan. But when rates rise to 4.5%, as they've done, that same $1,724 payment now pays a whopping $1,786 in interest, meaning the amount going to pay down principal is actually negative $62 in this case. At that point, a few things can happen. The payment can rise. The lender allows the loan to grow rather than shrink. That's called reverse amortization. Or the homeowner makes a lump sum payment. There is, of course, also the option to switch to a fixed rate mortgage, which will lock in a higher rate but be more predictable. The Bank of Canada estimates that 13% of all mortgages in Canada have now hit their trigger rate, and that as rates continue to rise, that number could jump to 17% by mid-2023. Well, for a certain portion of the population, fixed or variable is a big question. Is now the time to get fixated on fixed when it comes to your mortgage? And what's the best advice for people at or near a trigger rate? Jaimes Laird is the co-CEO of Ratehub.ca. Jaimes, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
So there is this growing number of people that will be dealing with this dilemma, but it's always this question people ask. They must ask you, should I be fixed? Should I be variable? Is now the time to kind of lean into one versus the other based on where rates are?
It really depends on your outlook, Amanda. If you believe the markets and that we're near the end of rate hikes and that rates might actually come down to fight a recession late this year or next year, then variable might be the best choice. But it, of course, comes with risk, because if inflation is more persistent, then the central bank will have to continue to increase rates, which means those variable rates will continue to rise.
So obviously, there are people that will be in a tough position here. And it sounds like from the analysis the Bank of Canada has done, the more recently you got your mortgage, probably the rougher shape you're in, because it was at a very low rate. It's early in your process. Do you think that we're going to see a period where people are in real jeopardy of having to make really hard calls, as we've seen in the past, of walking away from homes that are just underwater? Or do you see lenders being a little more accommodating?
You know, I think one thing we should be talking about when it comes to rising rates is the stress test. Anyone who got a variable rate, whether it was 6 months ago or a few years ago, they were stress tested in and around 5.25%. And that's about where anyone who has a variable, that's where their variable rate would be right now. So look, households are financially strained, that their mortgage payment has gone up, but they were tested, they were underwritten to the current rates, which should give you some peace of mind. I do think tough decisions are having to be made in households, but as long as the income is similar, no one's lost their job, people should be able to find the cash to make those payments.
Only a few seconds here, but you did mention that there are a number of people who did meet those stress tests and were at the stress test. That sort of implies that if rates go much higher, which we think they'll go a little higher, we don't know we don't think the bank's done yet, Jaimes. Will there be people that are then offside and underwater from the stress test that they did to get their mortgage?
Yeah, we're right at that point right now, Amanda. Now, there is one group who is feeling the brunt of this right away. Anyone with a variable rate and a variable payment, their mortgage payment has gone up immediately with each increase. So those mortgage payments are up about 50% these last 6 months, but default rates are not increasing. So those are the Canadians that are feeling this first, but they're managing to get by.
Jaimes, great to have your thoughts on this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Jaimes Laird is the co-CEO of Ratehub.ca. Well, one way to make houses more affordable is to build more of them. This week, the housing regulator, CMHC, said solutions have to include both governments and the private sector. It also reiterated that we need to build at least 3.5 million homes in the next 8 years. At current rates, we might build half that many. Mike Moffatt is a Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Mike, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So lots of talk, a little closing of the gap on the affordability question. Do you see any area where you put the most confidence? Is it in the plans we hear from cities or the feds to inject billions into homes? Where do we think we'll get this actual supply we need?
Well, there's all kinds of supply bottlenecks that we need to address. So some of it is on the zoning and regulatory side. So being able to build more density as of right, be able to get those approvals faster. So we certainly need that. We absolutely need investments in social housing, that there are parts of the market that private builders just cannot build inexpensively enough to allow that to happen. We need to address labor shortages. So, we're hearing from a lot of developers who have 2 or 3 projects they'd like to get started, but they've only got one crew of electricians and plumbers and roofers. So we need to address that. So there's no one silver bullet here, that there's a lot of different policies and different programs we need. And unfortunately, with economic conditions being what they are, with interest rates going up, we're actually seeing housing starts fall. So despite what the CMHC and others are telling us about our need for housing, we're actually seeing actual housing starts go in the wrong direction.
If you had to pick an area, it seems to me, Mike, that if we want to tackle affordability, and I don't mean a young person buying their first home, as important as that may be, I mean people having access to a good place to live for them and their family. Would it be the rental market? Should we be building more purpose-built rental spaces so that those prices come down and make life more affordable for a whole swath of people?
Yeah, we absolutely should be building more purpose-built rental, and I think we can look at tax reform to try and get the private sector to build more of these, to unlock some of that private capital on the sidelines. But we also have to recognize that housing is a system, and if you don't build enough housing for the middle class, what ends up happening is existing rental properties get bought up and sort of gentrified. We're seeing this across southern Ontario with the housing crisis, that places that had been affordable rentals are being renovated and turning into housing for families. So it's the sort of unfortunate situation of housing as a system, that it's always going to be the lowest incomes that suffer most. So if you've got 10 families and only 9 homes, likely it's going to be the 10th family with the lowest income that's left out in the cold, and in some cases quite literally.
One of the issues, we've talked about this before, but we do skew both culturally and economically, systemically, to the single-family home. All kinds of new bills in provinces, especially Ontario, really do seem aimed at more of those. Is that the right thing to do, or are we getting it a little bit wrong in terms of the kind of place we should want to live in?
Well, I think there's essentially a missing middle of family-sized units in apartments and other kinds of 3-story walk-ups. So if we look at the data for Ontario, we're actually building fewer single-family homes than we have since the 1950s and 60s. What we're building a lot of is apartment buildings and condos that are about 500 to 600 square feet, which are fantastic if you are single or you're a couple without children. But what's happening is that those couples are often having children. Baby comes along and they're like, this ain't gonna work. So they're having to leave those properties. So that's the part that's missing. So we're building a lot of tiny apartments. We are building some single-family homes, but fewer than we used to. But what we need is more family-sized homes that are dense in apartments and other places like that, so those families can still live in downtown urban centers, but have enough space for kids.
Mike, so good to have you. Really appreciate your time.
No, thank you for having me.
Mike Moffatt is Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Coming up, grocers are still in the hot seat over high food prices, but are they really profiting from inflation? But first, this. The historic amount of snow that fell on parts of BC's lower mainland this week turned a weather story into an economic one, with record snow and wind creating conditions that had drivers stuck on the roads for hours, into the double digits in the cases of some poor commuters. Meanwhile, the traffic jams kept snow clearing crews in the gridlock as well, like a domino effect, just a lot less fun. We're back after this.